How do you sit in a house for 2 days with your wife's body and still walk into a courtroom and call it self-defense? How do you send text messages from a dead woman's phone pretending to be her while she's lying in the next room? And how does that same man stay free for 2 more years, walking around, going to work, before a jury ever hears a word of it? T. Swims asked for a divorce. Days later, she was dead. And the story her husband told about a knife, about self-defense, about a woman who lunged at him, almost worked. Almost. This is the case of Anteeatta T. Swims. This is how a jury saw through it, and what it cost to get there. Ask anyone at Batesville Intermediate School about Dr. Anteeatta Swims, and they'll tell you the same thing before you even finish the question. Everyone called her T. 7 years as lead teacher at the same school. The kind of educator who didn't just show up. She stayed late, she chased down every kid who was falling behind, she brought a wealth of knowledge nobody had to ask her to share. T was born in November of 1985. By the time she was in her mid-30s, she'd built the kind of career people take decades to build. Not just a classroom job, a career with a direction. She wasn't teaching to pass the time, she was climbing, on purpose, towards something specific. That spring, 2021, she reached one of the biggest markers of that climb. She finished her doctorate, K-12 Educational Leadership and Administration, University of Mississippi. She walked at the hooding ceremony that April, the moment where a doctoral candidate has the formal hood placed over their gown, the visible marker that says, "This person did the work," all the way through. People who knew her say she wasn't done climbing after that. She wanted to be an assistant principal next. Eventually, she wanted to run a district, superintendent. On paper, in the spring of 2021, it looked like everything was falling into place for T. Swims. Behind it, her marriage had been quietly ending for a while. T. married David Swims in 2010. They moved to Oxford together in 2015, a college town, home to Ole Miss, the kind of place where everybody eventually knows somebody who knows you. David used a wheelchair. That went back further than the marriage. Injuries from a motorcycle accident, years before he ever met T. For a long time, by every outward account, they were just a married couple building a life in a quiet subdivision called the Lakes. By the summer of 2021, that life had come apart at the seams. They were sleeping in separate bedrooms. Not a metaphor, an actual daily fact of that house. T had told David plainly she wanted a divorce. Not someday. Now. She was adamant about it, according to David's own later testimony, his word, not softened by anyone else. David didn't want that. Text messages between them in the weeks before her death show him trying to talk her out of it, asking her to reconsider, to give the marriage one more chance. That's not speculation. That's what the messages themselves show, and both sides agreed on it at trial. T wasn't changing her mind. This is the detail everyone in that courtroom would come back to, eventually. Not what David said happened in that bedroom on June 8th. What he'd already written down, in his own words, 2 weeks before it. A man asking his wife to stay, being told no. Because in a few days, David would tell a very different story about who was afraid of whom in that house. And whether that story could survive his own text messages. That's what this case would come down to. Everything that happened next, we only have one full account of, because only one person in that house survived to tell it. According to David, and this is his version, the one he'd give a jury 2 years later, June 8th started ordinary enough. He got home from work around 5:30. He ran a computer and cell phone repair business in Oxford. Offered to cook dinner for T. T, he said, was already drinking wine. Her response, he testified, was short. "I don't need you to do a damn thing for me." So David says he went outside, stayed there most of the night, avoiding her, out on the deck, by his own account, for a good portion of the night. On its own, that's just a bad evening in a marriage that was already ending. Two people who'd stopped trying to fix things, giving each other space in the only way left to them. This is the detail investigators would come back to. Not because it was dramatic, because it was the last quiet moment either of them would get. The next morning, David says he went back inside. His shoes were in T's room. He needed them for work. And that's when, according to him, the night turned into something else entirely. David testified that he confronted T about infidelity, accusations he says he'd suspected for a while. He told the jury he pulled out his phone and played her a recording, audio, he claimed, of her and her own sister, moaning, having sex. He said T lost it, that he could tell by the look on her face that she was about to do something. He said T then picked up and unsheathed a knife that was near the bed. He told her to put it down, and he said that as the recording kept playing in the background, T lunged at him. He said he tried to back up, tilting his wheelchair away from her, and grabbed the gun she kept on her own bedside table, and it went off 3 times. That's the account. A recording of infidelity, a knife, a lunge, a gun that, in David's words, simply went off. Here's what doesn't fit into that account so easily. 3 gunshot wounds, 1 to the chest, 1 near the hip, 1 in the thigh. 3 times is not self-defense, the prosecutor would later tell the jury. He aimed and he shot her 3 times. A single reflexive shot during a struggle is one kind of story. 3 separate, placed wounds is a different one, and the distinction between those 2 stories is exactly what a jury would eventually be asked to decide. But that trial was still 2 years away. First, there were 2 days nobody outside that house knew anything was wrong. David didn't call 911. Not that morning, not the next day. For roughly 2 days, he stayed in the house with her, and somewhere in those 2 days, texts started going out from T's phone, to coworkers, to people who had no reason to think anything was wrong, because as far as they knew, they were hearing from her going about an ordinary week. She wasn't in a meeting at 4 that day, her sister Shalanda would say later, once she'd gone back through the messages. She didn't even go to work. On June 11th, one of David's own coworkers called to check on him. He'd missed work, and he'd sent some strange text messages to a few people at the shop. David told that coworker something the coworker couldn't just sit on. He said he'd shot T days earlier. The coworker told his boss. His boss called 911. The dispatcher who took that call did something worth noting. Before sending anyone out, she called David's house directly, just to check. Asked him plainly if everything was okay, with him and with his wife. It's the kind of ordinary procedural question a dispatcher asks a dozen times a shift. This time, the man on the other end of it had already told a coworker what had happened. He answered the dispatcher's call anyway. Then, deputies from the Lafayette County Sheriff's Department were sent out to the house on Spring Lake Cove. We're back where we started. Except now you know what those deputies didn't. Walking up to that door, they weren't checking on a missing woman who might turn up fine. They were about to become the first people outside that house to learn the truth, after it had already sat there, unspoken, for 2 full days. Here's where this case stops being simple. David was arrested June 11, 2021, and charged with murder. Bond was set at $100,000. He posted it, and for the next 2 years, while T's family waited for a trial date, while they went back to work and back to their own homes without her, David Swims was out, working, living his life in the same town. You're allowed to be angry here, because while everyone waited, investigators were building something the public wouldn't fully see until much later. A picture of who David Swims was, long before he ever met T. Records from Carroll County show that in 2000 and 2001, David faced simple assault and trespassing charges tied to his first marriage. In 2003, a simple assault charge against a deputy. He was ultimately found not guilty on that one, and, years later, it was T herself who helped him get that same charge expunged from his record. Sit with that for a second. The woman who would later die by his hand once helped clear his name. A 2007 offense report out of Grenada also surfaced during the investigation into David's background. His first wife told police that in 2006, David held her down on a couch with a screwdriver to her neck and raped her. That case was remanded to the file, meaning it was never formally pursued. David has denied all of it. "I was never abusive towards her. Never," he told a reporter, referring specifically to T. That denial is part of this record too, and it deserves to be heard alongside everything else. This isn't a closed case with its own verdict. It's background, allegation, context a jury would be allowed to weigh, not a separate finding of guilt. But T's mother, Elisa Archie, says David was verbally abusive throughout the marriage. T never told her sister about physical abuse directly. But in the weeks before she died, her sister noticed something small, the kind of detail that only makes sense in hindsight. T kept her arms covered during video calls. A neighbor, separately and without being asked, mentioned she'd once seen bruising. She was tired, her sister, Shalonda Archie Cook, would say. She realized that the life she was living was not what she wanted it to be. She attempted to leave him, and he killed her. The two sisters had talked about this kind of thing before, both, in different ways, in relationships that felt harder to leave than they should have been. Shalonda says she'd encouraged T to go, to follow her own heart, to do the things that made her happy. None of this, the prior charges, the allegations from her family, was ever its own separate case in a courtroom. It was context, background, the kind of pattern that doesn't get its own trial, but that shapes how a jury understands everything else they're shown. What prosecutors did have, concretely, provable on paper, was this. A felony already on David's record meant he wasn't legally allowed to possess a firearm at all. Not that gun, not any gun. Whatever happened in that bedroom, David wasn't supposed to have that weapon in his hands in the first place. That charge alone didn't depend on anyone believing or disbelieving his account of the shooting. It was a fact, sitting there, waiting. And investigators had the forensic timeline to work through. T's family didn't believe she died June 11th, the day she was found. They believed it happened 3 nights earlier, on the 8th or 9th, because of one detail that never sat right with them: the texts. She wasn't in a meeting at 4 that day, her sister said. She didn't even go to work. Someone was answering as T, in T's voice, on T's phone. It just wasn't T. 2 years. That's how long it took to turn a welfare check, a felon in possession charge, a disputed timeline, and a family's memory of a woman who covered her arms on video calls into an actual trial with a jury in the room. September 19th, 2023. The state of Mississippi versus David Lee Swims Jr. finally began in Lafayette County Circuit Court, with District Attorney Ben Creekmore leading the prosecution. For a case with no eyewitnesses, this trial came down to a strange kind of contest. Not who did it, everyone in that courtroom agreed on that going in. The question was why. And for that, the jury had exactly one living voice to weigh, David's own. There's a rule in Mississippi law that matters here, so it's worth taking a second on, because it's the rule David's entire defense was built around. It's called the Weathersby Rule, and it comes from a case almost 100 years old, decided by the Mississippi Supreme Court in 1933. In simple terms, if the defendant is the only living witness to a killing and his version of events is reasonable, the law says a jury should be told to accept it as true, unless the physical evidence or a credible witness for the state substantially contradicts him in the specific details that matter. In other words, David didn't need the jury to believe him beyond a doubt. His defense team just needed to convince the judge that nothing in the evidence was solid enough to call him a liar, solid enough to earn that special jury instruction, the one that tilts the whole case in a defendant's favor. So David took the stand, in his own defense, and told the jury everything: the wine, the argument, the night alone on the deck. The next morning, the accusation of infidelity, the recording on his phone, T picking up the knife, The gun on her nightstand. The lunge. 3 shots. That, in his words, the gun just went off. Then came cross-examination. And this is where reasonable, the exact word the Weathersby rule leans on, started to buckle. Prosecutors didn't need to produce a second eyewitness, because there wasn't one. What they had was David's own phone. Text messages from the 2 weeks before T died, sent by David himself, in his own hand, in real time, with no reason yet to shape a story, showed a man trying to talk his wife out of leaving, asking her to reconsider, trying to save the marriage. That's not a man who felt threatened by his wife. That's a man who didn't want to let go of her. This is the detail that mattered more than any single piece of forensic evidence, arguably more than anything else in the whole trial, because the Weathersby rule only protects an account that the physical facts or other evidence don't substantially contradict. And here was David, contradicted by nobody but himself, his own words, from 2 weeks before he ever mentioned a knife, telling a completely different emotional story about that marriage. Then came the autopsy findings. 3 gunshot wounds, 1 to the chest, 1 near the hip, 1 to the left thigh. 3 times is not self-defense, Assistant District Attorney Stephen Jubera told the jury in his closing argument. He aimed and he shot her 3 times. She was shot in the side. If she was coming at him, she would have been shot in the front. That single line does a lot of work. It's not just a rhetorical flourish. It's a claim about geometry, about where a body is positioned relative to a gun when a bullet enters from the side rather than head-on. It's the kind of detail a jury can actually picture, not just hear. The defense had one more card to play: David's wheelchair. His attorney, Mitchell Driscoll, argued that David's limited mobility meant he couldn't have simply left the house that night or in the 2 days after, that whatever happened partly because he had nowhere easy to go. It's a real fact about David's life, and the jury was allowed to weigh it seriously. This system doesn't ask viewers or juries to dismiss a genuine disability as irrelevant. What the jury weighed it against was 2 days of silence inside that same house, a body left where it fell, and messages sent from a dead woman's phone to people who had no idea she couldn't have sent them. A man limited in his mobility could still, apparently, reach a phone, could still type, could still choose, deliberately, not to reach for one particular number, 911. The jury got the case with 3 possible outcomes in front of them. First-degree murder, meaning a deliberate, planned killing. Second-degree murder, sometimes called depraved heart murder in Mississippi, a killing that comes from such reckless disregard for human life that intent almost doesn't matter. Or manslaughter, on a theory of imperfect self-defense, meaning David might have genuinely believed he was in danger, even if that belief wasn't reasonable, and used more force than the situation actually called for. They deliberated for 3 hours. Outside the courthouse, while they waited, T's family formed a circle, held hands, prayed. When the jury came back, guilty, second-degree murder, guilty too of possessing a firearm he was never legally allowed to have in the first place. David Swims, who had been free on bond for 2 years, walking through the same town where T's family had been grieving her, was taken into custody that afternoon. October 2023, sentencing. In Mississippi, second-degree murder carries a sentence of 20 to 40 years. The court gave David the maximum, 40 years, with 38 of them to actually be served, running alongside a separate 10-year sentence for the firearm charge, the felony possession that had nothing to do with anyone's competing story about a knife or a lunge, and everything to do with a fact nobody disputed. Shalonda Cook, T's sister, spoke afterward. "We are grateful justice was done," she said. Then she said the part that actually stays with you afterward: "None of it will ever bring my sister back to life." 40 years is a number. It's not a person, and her family never pretended otherwise. Her family didn't want T remembered as a case number, or a cautionary tale, or 40 years on a docket sheet. They wanted her remembered the way she actually lived, a loving sister, an educator who, in their words, loved with a full heart. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't, quite. David appealed his conviction. He argued three separate things: that the trial court should have given the jury that Weathersby instruction after all, the one that would have told them to take his word as true unless substantially contradicted, that the lead investigator, Captain Jarrett Bundren, had improperly given expert-level opinions on the stand when he wasn't qualified as an expert witness, and that the wrong pathologist had testified about T's autopsy, that the doctor who took the stand had only reviewed another examiner's report and photographs rather than performing the autopsy himself, which David argued violated his constitutional right to confront the witnesses against him. In August 2025, 4 years after that welfare check first sent deputies to Spring Lake Cove, the Mississippi Court of Appeals ruled. The conviction was upheld. The 40-year sentence was upheld. On that last argument about the pathologist, the court actually agreed with David that his rights had technically been violated, but called the error harmless, since most of what the substitute doctor testified to came from his own independent review of the autopsy photographs, which was allowed. It didn't change the outcome, and notably, the ruling wasn't unanimous. While most of the judges agreed to affirm the conviction, there was real disagreement among them about how to handle that one issue, even if it didn't move the final result. David can still ask the Court of Appeals for a rehearing. After that, he could ask the Mississippi Supreme Court to take the case. That door isn't fully closed, but as of now, 40 years stands. He'll spend the better part of the rest of his life inside a cell, in a place T never even got the chance to walk away from her marriage into a life of her own. Somewhere, there's a classroom at Batesville Intermediate that used to have Dr. Swims in it, at the front of the room, remembering which of her students had a birthday that week. Somewhere, there's a hooding ceremony photo from April 2021. Cap, gown, a woman who had just proven, on paper and in person, that she wasn't done yet. She asked for a divorce. That's all this should have ever cost her. We've told you what the evidence shows, what a jury decided after 3 hours, and what a court of appeals confirmed 4 years later. What David's own texts, his own timeline, and his own 2 days of silence add up to, that part isn't really up for debate anymore. But what it means that it took a felony charge, 2 years of him walking free, and a full trial to get here, that part's yours to sit with.